former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
It's time for inconvenient truth, and that is that the American people are dying to go back to work and normalcy. But the left says, no, let's wait and wait and wait. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. So today's show is going to be all about resetting the nation, the economy, the presidential race, and let's not forget no less than 468 congressional races that will shape our political future in a year that's got to be an even bigger wild card than the ultimate wild card 2016, won by the joker in the deck, the black swan, as some have called him, Donald Trump. We'll go from where things were before we hit the pause button for 2 months now to where we stand as we begin rebuilding an economy with so many lost jobs. It feels depressing just to state the numbers. 37 million people, 37 million of our fellow Americans filing for unemployment in the last 7 weeks. That's more than 5 million people a week out of work through no fault of their own. We'll be joined today by a trio of heavyweights from LibertyNation.com, political columnist Joe Schaeffer, economics maven Andrew Moran, and legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. And it's becoming more crystal clear by the day that reopening the country has become a partisan issue. Incredible as that is to believe in a country where normal people want to go back to work in their normal lives as quickly as possible, where they've had enough of fear and trembling. But while President Trump and most Republican governors are pushing hard to end the lockdowns expeditiously, Democrats, or most of them, are pushing for the opposite, keeping things closed at least until, let's take a wild guess here, say, Election Day? And the attitude of the leftist elites about reopening was revealed in breathtaking fashion, by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, leader of the Democrats, expressing support for another 3 months of lockdown in California's massive Los Angeles County.
Of course, I agree with the decisions of the people on the ground in their particular venue and location, because, again, as Dr. Fauci said earlier, and I wish the president would listen to him or hear him even, that you just cannot think that this is pretend it went away and go out there. So, yes, it's inconvenient.
Inconvenient? Inconvenient to lose your job through no fault of your own, have trouble feeding your family, paying your bills, making rent, worrying all the livelong day. And Nancy Pelosi calls another 3 months of that inconvenient. Modern-day Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake. Meanwhile, Pelosi's Senate soulmate, Chuck Schumer, was making political hay out of this public health crisis that wasn't caused by anyone, trying to tie Trump and his colleagues to the most infamous president in American history.
The Republican Party right now, from Donald Trump to Mitch McConnell, is sort of like Herbert Hoover. When the stock market crashed, Herbert Hoover said, we don't need to do anything, let the private sector work this out. And that caused, lengthened, and deepened the Great Depression. Let us hope that the public need and the public pressure will get the Republicans to understand what we need to do.
And that would be, wait for it, no, don't. Throw trillions more taxpayer money at the problem, because what the heck? We're so far gone with our national debt now approaching $30 trillion. What's a few trillion more? Let our kids and grandkids pay the tab. But in a way, talk of COVID was something of a relief for the Democrats and their sycophants in the elite media, because it meant they didn't have to talk as much as they ordinarily would about the latest Joe Biden problem, that he, along with almost 36 other high Obama officials, requested an unmasking of General Michael Flynn for reasons as yet unexplained, after Flynn saw charges against him mercifully dropped by the Justice Department this week. But Biden did go on Good Morning America and pulled his Sergeant Schultz act, I knew nothing, and actually can't even remember the question he was asked.
I know nothing about those moves to investigate Michael Flynn.
I do want to press that. You say you didn't know anything about it, but you were reported to be at a January 5th, 2017 meeting where you and the president were briefed on the FBI's plan to question Michael Flynn over those conversations he had with the Russian ambassador Kislyak.
No, I thought you asked me whether or not I had anything to do with him being prosecuted.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was aware that they asked for an investigation, but that's all I know about it.
But if you thought that was lame, listen to the person sent out to speak for the Democratic National Committee, whose job it is to spin the news to her party's advantage. And this was the best they could come up with. Xochitl Hinojosa, Democrats' Director of Communications, explaining away Biden's interest in unmasking Flynn and trying to change the subject of the old debunked refrain of collusion under the persistent questioning of Bill Hemmer of Fox News.
Is something that you are just looking to see more intelligent. It is nothing that is scandalous in any way. But frankly, this is going to backfire on Republicans because it just showed how serious Flynn was and his conversations with the Russians.
Is that a crime to talk to other countries during that period? Is that against the law?
Whenever you are trying to interfere in an election or in any way try to go against the United States, I think that, that is something that is.
The answer there was a suggestion that there was collusion. There's been no proof of that. Where's yours?
You continue to see this Justice Department and specifically, Bill Barr trying to cover up for the president generally.
One more time. Where's the proof about collusion, Sochi?
Well, I leave that to the investigators. I encourage you to look at all of the work that Democrats have done in the House to continue to show the cover-up by Donald Trump.
She is covering up by alleging a cover-up by Trump. See how that works? It's called projection. Deflect onto your enemies that which you are guilty of yourself. And here comes this week's Exhibit A in projection. In the wake of revelations that senior officials going right up to the president himself, that's Obama, were commanding wiretapping on the incoming head of the National Security Council, former Attorney General Eric Holder had the chutzpah to go on MSNBC and say that Flynn's exoneration represents exactly what his man Obama and his cohorts did.
My concern is that we move from the defensive to the offensive, that they will use the power of the Justice Department, the power of the criminal justice system to go after people who are perceived as enemies of this president. That is something that I say reluctantly, but I think based on the record that we have seen, they are up to doing that, to use the system in that way, which would be unprecedented.
Unprecedented when we now know that the Obama Justice Department, headed by Holder for years, was doing exactly that themselves. This is how truth no longer matters to the left. It's all narrative, false narrative, pinning Republicans with the very sins they have committed so egregiously and audaciously themselves. But you know one thing for absolute certain, and that is that President Trump will not stop talking about this. And he put this week's revelations into his own political context.
It was the greatest political crime in the history of our country. If I were a Democrat instead of a Republican, I think everybody would have been in jail a long time ago. This was all Obama. This was all Biden. These people were corrupt. The whole thing was corrupt, and we caught them.
And Trump is getting backstopped in this by prominent members of the House and Senate, including Devin Nunes, Rand Paul, and Lindsey Graham.
General Flynn is really just the tip of the iceberg. What it appears to me like what they were doing is a lot of them went wild after Trump won. They got poisoned with this Russia hoax.
If Vice President Biden and the president's inner circle of advisors were all listening to a senior Trump administration advisor's private phone conversation, this would amount to a serious abuse of power.
This is an outrage. It's at least unethical, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. They had no business listening to anything General Flynn was saying about Trump policy.
And yet they made it their business. Folks, we have no previous case in American history of a president and his administration wiretapping first his political enemy and then successor in the White House. If that doesn't scare the bejesus out of the American people, one wonders what it would take. And we'll be back to reset the economic landscape across the land as we attempt a return to normalcy.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, if you thought the forecast, the models predicting anywhere from a high of over 2 million deaths in the U.S. from COVID to a low of 60,000, all of which have been wrong, even dead wrong, have been a roller coaster ride. You think that's a roller coaster ride? How about the financial markets? Catastrophic slides, recovery, down again, up again, as the Fed drops interest rates to rock bottom to stimulate a dying economy. So where do we really stand with the economy 2 months into the shutdown as we finally look to reopen at long last? Here to answer that simple question with the more complicated answer is the man who always unwinds these complicated financial and fiscal matters for us, LibertyNation.com economics correspondent Andrew Moran. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. So, it appears, at least to the untrained eye, that markets have stabilized. The Dow's been steadily hovering around 24,000 for a while, recovering about half the value it lost in the crash that started the descent. Do we have reason, justifiable reason for optimism, or is this more wishful thinking considering the current dire straits of the economy?
There are two main factors to explain this rally. The first is, of course, that the market had already priced in a lot of this damage. So they're forward-looking. They're looking to economies reopening, businesses opening again, things like that. The other major factor is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has pumped so much liquidity into the system, trillions of dollars. And Jerome Powell, he left the door open yesterday during his delivered remarks about how, the Fed could intervene again with even more stimulus, trillions more. And he urged the Congress to also implement more fiscal stimulus. So, there is all this money being flown into to Wall Street. So Wall Street is pretty much, it's being insured for any losses that it may incur, any more buying that it's going on. But it's what's interesting, before we had this meeting, I was looking at data during the Great Depression, and you had these multi-month rallies and spikes before you had these considerable pullbacks in the 1930s. So there's a lot of precedent for bear market fakes. But I think overall there is still reason, to be optimistic about the stock market, basically because of the Fed's do whatever it takes approach to monetary policy, which is what every other central bank has conceded to doing, do whatever it takes. And, as what's funny about it is that the European Central Bank, this was their moniker even before the financial crisis. That's how anemic their growth was.
Well, now, three basic scenarios have been laid out for the condition of the economy when the virus or the worst of it finally passes: recovery, recession, depression. Which is most likely to occur in your view, and why?
Well, I think we already are probably in a recession. We still have to wait for the GDP numbers, but it's safe to say that the U.S. is going to be in a depression. So you have that checked off on your list. I think a depression would only happen if there's a second wave if a second wave happens in the fall and the country and other countries and American states have to adopt similar restrictions or perhaps even shutdowns. Though I think Jared Kushner, he said the other day that it's probably not going another nationwide lockdown is not going to happen. So that's a possibility. But overall, a recovery is inevitable. It's just the speed of it really depends on a multitude of factors. Fiscal monetary policy. Will there be this pent-up demand that a lot of business experts and the White House has said there's going to be once the lockdown's lifted? And then you also have the concern about the severity of the coronavirus. There's still so much uncertainty about the makeup of the coronavirus, and will it mutate? Is it going to be is it benign? All these different factors that you have to consider. And Jerome Powell, he even said during his speech that the recovery is going to be slower than you would want. The thing that you have to do is, pump more money into the economy to ensure that you do have a reliable recovery, 3, 6, 9 months.
Now, China, their outright dishonesty and intransigence in letting the virus spread for weeks before telling us how serious it was, among other things, has led to widespread criticism, of course, of the Chinese and our relationship with them, our dependence on them. Are you picking up on changes in the financial markets in terms of relationships with China?
Well, actually, I wrote a few weeks ago about how the made in China trend is probably going to shift in the next few years. You're already starting to see it gradually happen. You have some American companies shifting their operations to Taiwan and Thailand, another a cheap labor jurisdiction. And I'm backed up by a lot of the Wall Street titans who are warning about they're going to have more regional supply chains. You're going to have capital leaving China. The only thing that the issue is that they've developed such a huge presence in China because they want to tap into that growing middle class that's occurring in Beijing. But overall, there's going to be a shift away from made in China. The thing I'm worried about is that the government's going to mandate it as opposed to allowing the market to dictate it.
Thank you for clarifying a lot of things and trying to make some sense out of this crazy roller coaster ride of an economy. Stay well.
Thank you.
Andrew Moran, economics correspondent for LibertyNation.com. So we've now reset the economic landscape, and we'll do the same thing with the presidential race, where we are and where we're headed, in just a moment.
Where can you find honest political commentary? With sobering analysis.
Even the most trusting among us may find a company's latest plans deeply intrusive.
Accountability.
Perhaps it's time to start asking the right questions.
Deconstructing threats to our liberty.
Unparalleled insight into important stuff.
And boldly reporting the truth. Truth is making a comeback.
Well, hello again, and welcome to Election 2020 Roundtable.
Uprising podcast of LibertyNation.com.
Abortion is functionally sexist.
From my cold, dead hand.
Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
Click on youtube.com/LibertyNation.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
There is a presidential election in 5.5 months, folks. And lest you say, duh, what is this guy talking about? What does he think, we're stupid? No, it's just that we may never have seen so little attention paid to a presidential campaign and this dramatic and intervening event during a campaign ever. But the election's coming off one way or another, and now Joe Biden's under the Klieg lights again for his role in the Michael Flynn affair, here to help us pick up where we essentially left off 2 months ago, and where we're likely to pick up with a real presidential campaign again is LibertyNation.com political columnist, our old friend Joe Schaeffer. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Good to see you again.
It's been way too long, my friend. We did this about a month ago, but there wasn't much to talk about. But now there is regarding Joe Biden. So let me put the question to you right off the bat. How big a problem is it for the former vice president ultimately that he was one of some 36 Obama officials who requested to unmask Michael Flynn?
Yeah, it should be a major deal. This should be investigating. The investigators should be huge now that we're learning more each day. I just don't think it's going to be. This country has been so polarized on this issue ever since Trump took office. And I just think that the minds have been made and they're not going to be changed, even though they should be. Undecided voters, people who had never had a strong feeling on this, have tuned it out a long time ago because it was so overblown. The coronavirus has come in. I just don't think they want to engage in this. And the people who are engaged on this, they've made up their minds a long time ago on who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. So I think Biden's going to get a pass on this. And it's a shame because he really does not deserve it.
So it looks like we're looking in one way or another at a shorter election campaign, much shorter than we're used to, effectively. Would that be good for the country? Would it be good for Trump? Would it be good for Biden?
I think it's great news for Joe Biden. The least effort he has to put in and the more mistakes that he can avoid as a result, the better off he is. They want to package Biden. They want to hide him. I think that they'd love a New York, a Democratic campaign strategist who worked for Pete Buttigieg wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying as much. They'd love to have this guy do nothing but local and national TV news appearances. And that's his whole campaign. So for the Democrats, this is ideal. I think Trump, live debates, get out there, meet people. That's what he's best at. He draws energy from that. So I think a standard campaign like 2016 would help Trump more. I still think he's in a great situation, so I think he's okay. For the country at large, we have politics 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So short, long campaign, I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference, but I do think it helps Biden and maybe takes away a little bit from Trump. Although, like I said, he's still looking pretty good.
Well, it feels almost like parliamentary elections, where they have usually a 6 or 8 week campaign. It doesn't go on for like 18 months or 2 years like we have here. And whether we like it or not, that's what we're likely to get effectively again. I mean, the campaign is on, but there's not much attention on it. Seems to me it'll really focus attention again when the conventions come during the summer. But the question about whether this break's been good for Joe Biden or not, to me, revolves around whether the voters will accept in this new COVID world or post-COVID world, whatever you're going to call where we are in November, whether they'll accept a candidate who's distancing himself, socially distancing himself from the voters or not, because they are certainly not used to that.
Yeah, and I think Biden is almost just a figurehead at this point. He just represents, let's get a Democrat in the White House. No one's excited about Joe Biden. In a weird way, I think it's these Democrat governors and their over the top, I would call it tyrannical policies that are going to influence whether how Joe Biden does. Whitmer in Michigan and the governor in Oregon, they are treating their citizens like children. And they are saying, I don't care how you think about it. You are doing what I say. And I think there will be some kind of backlash on this with voters. And that is going to seal Biden's doom if he does lose, more than anything Joe Biden's going to do. I think what happens with how voters react to these lockdowns and the coronavirus is going to have more to do with this election than anything Joe Biden's going to do over the next few months.
Okay, so then that begs the question. Coronavirus has changed the entire political climate. It's changed the issues. It's at the top of people's lists of concerns of top issues for the election, something that they'd never even heard of 3 months ago, and now it's the most important issue. Does the fact of the coronavirus intervention itself help Trump or hurt Trump?
I think he would have been better off had it never happened. The economy would be still sailing along. Not that it was perfect, but it was doing well. He's still popular with his base. That's not going to change. So I don't know if it hurts him as much. It's just strange how this feeds into a democratic dynamic. They always have to have a crisis. Russia, the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination, the Ukraine, there's always got to be some apocalyptic event to unite them. And what we've learned from the three previous apocalyptic events that I mentioned is it didn't really convince the American people as a whole. So they're 0 for 3 if you really look at it. Coronavirus, they're hoping to hit a home run with and get Joe Biden in. I don't see any reason to believe it's going to happen. And I think Trump's been just fine through this whole thing. I don't think he's been a superstar, which he portrays himself as, but he's handled the situation fine. I don't think voters are going to resent him. And I don't think they're going to be convinced by the latest Democratic doomsday scenario to vote for Joe Biden in November. It's going to go over about as well as the other circuses.
So Trump has been exposed day after day, to a degree that he wouldn't be even as a sitting president seeking re-election because of the COVID crisis. Now, of course, he's tamping down the appearances now. They're shorter, less frequent, but nevertheless, he's up there, or has been over the course of these 2 months, pretty much every day trying to be large and in charge, which is really what a president needs to be here. But has that attention, which is the flip side of having to deal with a crisis, is that you can show that you're in command. You get an opportunity to demonstrate command of a crisis. Has all that attention been a good thing for Trump, or has it exposed some of his weaknesses, re-exposed some of his weaknesses to voters who've been very wary of the constant political battles during his administration?
Well, I think the key thing you mentioned is the energy, the dynamic. He has shown unlimited reserves of energy. And when you look at his presumptive opponent, who seems to be fading by the day, has no energy, that's going to play well for him in November. I think people look past the sound bites and individual quotes that you can carve up Trump with. That's never hurt him before. We learned that in 2016. And they look at the big picture. And I still think that his supporters are behind him 100%. But the people who voted for him in 2016 are going to see him the same way, that he's still this change agent, that he's different from this establishment. He's not in step with them in a way that the Democratic establishment, and Joe Biden is the Democratic establishment, conjures up. So I think that him constantly being on is just fine. And I think he's going to, again, represent to the American people that I am not part of this establishment. Saying reopen the country is going to help him when this establishment is saying, hey, let's not do that. And the American people, quite frankly, are ready to reopen.
I think the signs are unmistakable. Now, I have to leave with a question that is unavoidable given Joe Biden, shall we say, deteriorating neurological condition, the gaffes. I mean, this week he forgot the question that he was asked during a big interview on Good Morning America by George Stephanopoulos. Now, whether that was deliberate or not, I don't know which would be worse, that he actually did forget it or that he pretended he forgot it because he wanted to evade the question about Michael Flynn. But you can't avoid the question of whether there's still a chance that the Democratic Party could turn tail and pick someone else to be their presidential nominee. Is there any kind of realistic chance that that could still happen?
Yeah, I think so, just because I think they may be forced to. Biden breaks down completely. I mean, he's really limping along, and we've got a long way to go. Again, every time a name comes up, they seem to get shot down of their own accord. Governor Cuomo in New York with his nursing home scandal, which is really bad. Look at the incompetence of putting the most vulnerable population at risk like that. That is going to have huge political ramifications if they throw his name up there. I think he's hurt big time by that. And so we've lost another one of their heroes of the moment. So they're going to have to come up with somebody else. I don't see anyone on the horizon right now. They may be stuck with Joe Biden, and they may go into November with a voting base that does not care about this guy. I think that a lot of people are going to stay home, which of course would help Trump because his supporters are going to get out there and vote.
Okay, Joe, great to have you back in the saddle again. We'll be doing this with greater frequency as we approach the election, which, again, folks, is only 5.5 months away from deciding the future of the country for the next 4 years and perhaps well beyond that. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That is Joe Schaeffer, political columnist for LibertyNation.com. And we'll return with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now, finally, we have reached the ultimate section of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It is when we reintroduce our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and our guardian of individual liberty, back in the saddle, back in Studio A, ladies and gentlemen, Scott Cosenza.
We may technically be within 6 feet of one another, too, Tim. It feels good to be here. Thank you.
Technically, if you're watching the video, I think you can judge that we're about 6 feet, 2 inches apart from each other, right, just to be safe.
For the governor's sake, we'll say that's right.
Yes, for Governor Northam. Now, Mike Flynn. I know you mostly want to discuss this Flynn case from the angle of Judge Emmett Sullivan's call for arguments in opposition to Mr. Flynn, charges against whom were dropped this week.
Well, they're not. It's a question about whether they are actually dropped, right? There's a process, and part of the process involves a judge entering an order sort of confirming the dropping and dismissal of charges. And before he does so, Judge Sullivan has said he wants to hear from people who want to argue that he should not do so in the form of an amicus brief. I find his call for these arguments to be very disturbing. You know, federal judges, Tim, can do all sorts of things that aren't specifically prohibited to them, but are horrible ideas and work against, I think, notions of justice. And Judge Sullivan has every month in the many, many months this case has gone on, has rejected people's attempts to file amicus briefs in the case. A judge doesn't have to accept them. And all of a sudden, when now we have the disclosure of the unmasking reports, further indication that it was a political railroad job rather than a legitimate, attempt to get justice in the face of criminality, you'd think that the judge would sign off on it.
How common is it for a judge to reject the amicus brief, which basically means a friend of the court brief trying to project a certain position?
It's an interesting question. They're not usually submitted in individual criminal trials. They're usually submitted, Tim, when larger issues of constitutional law are being decided. So in an abortion case, a gun control case, these sorts of things is where we see groups filing amicus briefs. But for an individual criminal defendant, it's very much atypical. I had never even heard of it. I didn't even know it was a thing. I did look into the law, and it seems like Judge Sullivan's order is not, on the face of it, illegal or against other court precedent. And that doesn't mean it's consistent with Mr. Flynn's constitutional rights. That still could be violative of them. I just mean he's not a total maverick here, but that doesn't mean it's okay or a good idea.
Well, we're gonna hear more about this Flynn story. It hasn't gone away, and both sides want to talk about it for obviously opposite reasons. Meanwhile, Scott, a federal judge has rejected plea bargain deals that limit compassionate release, calling them appallingly cruel.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity for, federal judges often exercise independent authority in dealing with these judgments in a good way for and upholding the rights of the accused. So in this case, Charles Breyer, who's in the Northern District of California, rejected a plea deal which required, you have to remember, in any type of plea deal, and just like in the case with Mr. Flynn, the government's in the power position, right? They're the ones calling the shots by and large. And if you want the deal, you kind of have to agree to what they say. And part of what they do, Tim, is to restrict rights on appeal. And in this case, not only just rights on appeal, but compassionate release rights. And so what that means is if somebody has, for instance, a terminal illness, and they're basically going to be dying in a month or two, they can appeal to the Bureau of Prisons and maybe get out of jail or prison for that last month or so of their life, which, by the way, is not only good for the incarcerated person. They're not likely to reoffend in that time, but it's also good for the federal system to not have to bear the burden of that care, by the way. So it's kind of a win-win. But the problem is those people aren't rewarded for getting those folks out of prison, and so they drag their feet oftentimes, just bureaucratic process. Well, the federal prosecutors want to limit the right of the people to appeal that process at their sentencing. And so what they do is they say, okay, you want a deal? Here, we'll give you this deal. Also, you're going to waive all these rights. And the judge says, you can't waive that compassionate release right. It's absolutely appallingly cruel. And I just thought it was an interesting juxtaposition to Judge Sullivan, right, who is working to frustrate the rights of this person who was in his court, rather than Judge Breyer, who is working to kind of bolster the rights of the accused and uphold kind of a more lofty, I think, notion of justice there.
So we have presented, in a sense, a yin and yang of the federal judicial system, but you spent an awful lot of time this week, Scott, on the case of Ahmaud Arbery and a video that surfaced that has gone viral and created yet another explosive racial situation.
That's right, Tim. Sadly, it looks like we have another tragic case where somebody was killed or maybe murdered, but that also that killing or murder is being used to basically drive a frenzy of reaction that it was a racially hatred-motivated crime, which there is yet to be no evidence for whatsoever. I wanted to say this, too. Because of the way that the shooting went down, I wouldn't be surprised if the McMichaels are going to perhaps be acquitted of murder. And it has to do with the very last seconds of Mr. Arbery's life and what may have happened there.
And what do we know?
Well, what we know is that there was a chase. We know that there was a physical altercation, whether Mr. Arbery at the final moment of his life charged into Mr. McMichael is, I think, in dispute. And also whether or not that would make any self-defense claim void or moot or empower it, Tim. These are all things that have to be kind of worked out with a very slow, careful look at the evidence. You know, the idea that we can just automatically say this was a lynching, I think, is beyond the pale. It was certainly not any kind of lynching. Now, it may have been an illegal killing, but also perhaps not.
I have a feeling we're going to find out a lot more about this in the week ahead. We'll probably talk about it next week.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.